Story 1. The Nurse Who Decided Which Children Lived. Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in England was not a frightening place. At least, it wasn't built to be one. It was a local hospital, the kind of place parents brought their children when they had a high fever, trouble breathing, or simply needed to be monitored overnight. Especially the children's ward, a place that was supposed to be quiet, clean, and filled with trust. That trust was placed in people wearing white uniforms, and in a young nurse named Beverley Allitt. Allitt was not the kind of person who drew attention. She was small, quiet, hardworking, and rarely caused trouble. To her colleagues, she was a dedicated nurse. To parents, she was the one who always seemed to appear at the right moment when something went wrong. But that was exactly the problem. Within a short period of time, unusual things began to happen in the children's ward. Children who had been admitted with minor conditions, dehydration, mild infections, routine observations, suddenly deteriorated for no clear reason. Heart rates dropped rapidly. Blood sugar levels became unstable. Some children slipped into critical condition just minutes after being considered stable. And strangely enough, Beverley Allitt was almost always there. At first, no one was suspicious. Children are fragile. Medicine is not perfect. Complications can happen. But when the number of cardiac arrests began to rise abnormally, doctors started whispering among themselves. Not because they believed someone was acting deliberately, but because the odds no longer made sense. In some cases, a doctor had just left the room, and the child's condition was still stable. Minutes later, an alarm would sound, and when they returned, Allitt was there, performing resuscitation, calling for help, playing the role of the hero in the most chaotic moments. Some children did not survive. Others survived, but were left with permanent damage. Internal reviews were launched. Medical records were examined. Shift schedules were compared. And slowly, a chilling pattern emerged. The serious incidents only occurred when Allitt was on duty. What people struggled to accept was the motive. Allitt didn't steal money. She had no personal conflicts. She held no hatred toward the families. So why? The answer began to surface when doctors examined her behavior after each incident. Allitt seemed to enjoy being at the center. She enjoyed the chaos. She enjoyed the attention, the praise for her life-saving efforts. She found meaning in standing at the boundary between life and death. Medical evidence later showed that many of the children had been deliberately affected by substances that caused severe physiological disruption, enough to push them into critical condition, but not always enough to kill them immediately. This created the perfect scenario for Allitt to appear as a saving angel. When the police became involved, the truth could no longer be denied. But what shook the entire country was not only the crime, it was the setting. This was not a dark alley, not an unknown attacker. This was a hospital, and the victims were children. In court, Allitt was unable to provide any reasonable explanation. Psychological experts spoke of a need for attention, emotional manipulation, and the pursuit of power through a caregiving role. But no explanation was enough to ease the pain of the families. The story of Beverley Allitt permanently changed how hospitals viewed trust. From that point on, monitoring procedures were tightened. It was no longer assumed that a white uniform automatically meant absolute safety, because the most painful lesson of all was this: sometimes, the danger doesn't come from a stranger, but from the person you trusted with your child's life. Story 2. The Nurse Who Made Murder Look Like Medical Failure. Hospitals for children are not built for death. They exist to protect the most fragile lives, newborns, infants, bodies too small to defend themselves. And inside one of those hospitals in Texas, there was a nurse named Genene Jones. Jones did not appear cold or distant. On the contrary, she was known for being devoted, staying late, volunteering for extra shifts, always willing to help. To parents, she looked like a guardian angel, the nurse who stayed close when their child's condition worsened. That image concealed something horrifying. During the time Jones worked, an unusually high number of infants and young children began slipping into critical condition. Cardiac arrests, respiratory failure, sudden collapses with no clear cause. At first, no one questioned it. Children are vulnerable. Medicine cannot prevent every complication. But slowly, doctors began to notice a pattern they could no longer ignore. Genene Jones was always there. She was often the first to notice deterioration, the first to call an emergency, the first to rush into action. To many, she looked like a hero constantly fighting death. But not every child survived. Some lived on with permanent damage. Medical records were reviewed, shift schedules were compared, and a chilling pattern emerged. The unexplained crises clustered around Jones's shifts. What made the case even more disturbing was how the deaths appeared. There were no wounds, no signs of violence, only physiological reactions that looked like natural complications, the kind medicine sometimes struggles to explain. Investigators later discovered that several children had been deliberately affected with commonly used medical substances, administered in amounts sufficient to cause collapse, but difficult to detect immediately. It made the deaths look like accidents. Jones did not act impulsively. She was patient. Each emergency became a stage. Each alarm, a moment of attention. Each resuscitation, a chance to be needed. When suspicion grew, Jones left the hospital, but the deaths followed her. At later workplaces, similar incidents quietly reappeared. Eventually, law enforcement stepped in. There were no eyewitnesses, no single moment caught in the act, only a trail of suffering and one nurse consistently present. In court, psychologists describe Jones as someone driven by a deep need to be needed, to be admired, to control life and death through the role of a caregiver. Death was not the goal. It was the tool. Genene Jones's story forced the medical system to confront a painful truth. Not every danger in a hospital comes from illness. Sometimes, it comes from the person trusted to protect life. Story 3. The nurse killed someone for attention. Let me ask you to imagine something. You're in a hospital room late at night, the kind of quiet that only exists after visiting hours are over. Machines hum softly, monitors blink, and the person lying in the bed is a veteran, someone who survived war, only to end up here. Now imagine that the person assigned to care for them is also the reason they're dying. Kristen Gilbert worked as a nurse at a VA hospital in Massachusetts. On paper, she was exactly who you'd want in that role. Trained, experienced, calm under pressure. And when emergencies happened, she didn't panic. She stepped forward, again, and again, and again. At first, her coworkers admired her. Whenever a patient suddenly went into cardiac arrest, Gilbert was often the first one there. She called codes, she assisted doctors, she stayed composed while everyone else scrambled. To some staff members, she looked heroic. But heroes aren't supposed to leave patterns. Over time, something felt off. Patients would be stable, comfortable, not critical. Then suddenly, alarms would go off. Heart failure, cardiac arrest, collapse with no warning. And almost every time, Kristen Gilbert was present. At first, no one wanted to believe it meant anything. Hospitals see death, especially VA hospitals. Many patients are already fragile. But statistics don't lie forever. Doctors started quietly reviewing records, shift schedules, timelines, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. When Gilbert worked, people died more often. What made this case especially disturbing wasn't just the deaths, it was what happened afterward. Gilbert didn't withdraw. She didn't avoid attention. She leaned into it. She comforted coworkers. She spoke softly to grieving families. She positioned herself as the emotional center of every tragedy. And slowly, investigators began to suspect the unthinkable. The emergencies weren't random. They were being created. Evidence suggested deliberate interference actions designed to push patients into cardiac arrest, not to guarantee death every time, but to trigger chaos. Because chaos brought attention. Psychologists later described Gilbert as someone driven by a need to be seen, to be important, to feel indispensable. In those moments of crisis, everyone needed her. She wasn't saving lives. She was manufacturing moments where she could be the one who responded. As suspicion grew, Gilbert's personal life began to unravel as well. Lies stacked on top of lies. Stories contradicted each other. And eventually, the image of the devoted nurse started to crack. When she was finally arrested, many people refused to believe it. Because accepting the truth meant facing something terrifying. That the person comforting you in your worst moment might also be the reason that moment exists. In court, Gilbert denied responsibility. She deflected, she minimized, but the pattern was undeniable. Too many deaths, too much proximity, too much coincidence. She wasn't motivated by money. She wasn't driven by hatred. She wanted significance. Kristen Gilbert's story is unsettling because it doesn't rely on rage or madness. It relies on something quieter, something far more common: the desire to matter, the hunger for attention, the need to feel powerful in a place where life and death are always close. And that's the part that stays with you. Because hospitals are built on trust. Uniforms are symbols of safety. But once that trust is broken, it never fully comes back. And sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one fighting death, it's the one quietly creating it. 3 people, 3 hospitals, and one terrifying truth. The power over life and death wasn't taken by force. It was handed over, willingly, to people in white uniforms. One nurse in a children's ward. One who made murder look like medical complications. And one who created death just to feel important. Because deep down, there's something uncomfortable we all have to face. When someone is given absolute trust, absolute authority, and no one is watching closely enough, the line between healer and killer can disappear. So now I want to know, which story stayed with you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more real cases like this, told slowly, honestly, and without filters, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This is Dark File, where the darkest human records are finally brought into the light.